Thank you everybody for joining. It looks like we've got a really robust crowd today, and so I'm excited to host this event. Welcome to the RSA Conference Lightning Talk. Challenge accepted. 3 experts, 3 big ideas on supply chain security. In this session, we're going to hear from 3 experts, some of whom you see on screen now. Each will have 7 minutes to share their big idea. And at the end of that time, we will have about 5 minutes each for Q&A. Now, while they're speaking, you can add your questions into the chat. You can be thinking of them, and I'll throw those out as time allows. So let's get started. First, I'd like to introduce Matt Wickhouse. Matt is the founder and CEO of Finite State, where they focus on automating the security testing and risk assessment process for connected devices and their supply chains. Before that, Matt was the CTO of the cybersecurity business unit at Battelle, where he supported national security programs relating to cyber and supply chain security for more than a decade. So Matt, I will throw it over to you.
Thanks, Bo. Hi, everyone. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide here. So most of us have probably heard the phrase, the S in IoT stands for security. It's kind of a fun phrase there, but the bottom line is that everyone instinctively believes that IoT devices are insecure. But what about other types of connected devices? The ones that make up more than 50% of the endpoints on most networks today, everything from OT devices to networking equipment, physical access and security systems. They're all embedded systems with the same security challenges as well. And they've all been affected by a slew of vulnerabilities lately, from Urgent 11 and Ripple 20 to Amnesia 33 and Bad Alec. It seems like hundreds of millions of devices are found to be severely vulnerable every few months. And that's not even factoring in the potential for malicious supply chain compromise, which is part of the reason that we're all here talking about supply chain today. So our big idea is actually probably a pretty simple and obvious idea, which is that the reason for a lot of these issues and insecurity and perception of insecurity is that we just aren't doing enough testing and verification throughout the process. In our experience working with a lot of vendors who are building connected products, I can say very concretely that most vendors actually do want to build secure devices, but it's challenging to do that. And most of the existing application security tools and approaches for AppSec out there tend to fail to comprehensively assess the risk and find vulnerabilities across an entire embedded system, which is a bit different than what you would see with a traditional app. And also, the users of these devices need some level of visibility into the testing and the results of that testing so that they can feel comfortable in understanding the risks and seeing whether they meet their risk tolerance. So what we are looking at here is that vendors need to incorporate appropriate security testing and supply chain risk management into their development process. So that's the traditional kind of DevSecOps process that we've thought about and looked at for a long time, except for it needs to be tuned to support the needs of connected and embedded device development. So this is what we call DevSecOps, where we're working today. And that means you need really robust testing across both first and third-party components. One of the things that's really challenging with embedded devices is usually more than 80% of the software inside of there is coming from third parties. And so you need to have a robust software composition analysis, static application security testing, dynamic analysis, some manual penetration testing. All of that needs to be incorporated into a product security program and testing program. And whatever you use, it needs to work on your embedded systems architectures, programming languages, and tool chains. Additionally, with physical products, there's a couple other things that are unique that need to be accounted for. The first is that you have system and operating system level risks that can stem from misconfigurations, things like hard-coded credentials, misconfigured and vulnerable services. Traditional tools don't necessarily find those sorts of things, and they need to be investigated as part of the product security lifecycle. You need to be collecting and generating your software bill of materials and hardware bill of materials so that you can provide that information to your customers and so that you can manage your supply chain, the provenance of your supply chain, and map that to any compliance and regulatory frameworks that you might have. And finally, you probably want to do some level of testing of the final build to make sure that nothing has changed from the point of time of testing to the point of time that you're delivering this. Moving forward, when the vendor sells that product and delivers it to a customer at procurement time, the asset owners can request this data, and they should. And it should be entered into a risk repository, similar to how we handle third-party risk for vendors, but doing this for products and software that we're bringing into our networks. And then finally, some asset owners, especially in high security environments, might need to do some additional verification. They might need to do, in the OT world, what's called a site acceptance test, testing that device once it comes into their organization. They can run a penetration test, they can analyze the firmware and software, whatever they need to do. If we do this well and kind of incorporate these multiple test points throughout the life cycle of the device, that supply chain risk repository will provide a wealth of information that can be used to support the overall security lifecycle of the device. You can map the risk data that you generate from those test results to a risk model that's appropriate to your organization. You can factor in things like how much you care about the provenance of the components that are coming in, how much you care about open source issues, how much you care about specific types of vulnerabilities. All of that can be custom tuned to your risk tolerance. And then probably the best part is when you have this level of intelligence about the devices and software coming into your organization, you can use that for the rest of your security lifecycle. So you can arm your vulnerability management team with the software bill of materials for those endpoints so that you can start to find and mitigate vulnerabilities quickly. Your threat detection team now has a little bit more insight into what's going on inside of those devices, what services they're supposed to be using, so they can better detect issues with them. So the bottom line is that we really think that every organization has a different risk tolerance. Every organization should have their own kind of risk framework for how to look at what they're willing to accept from a supply chain risk standpoint. But you should be able to make risk-based decisions, and more verification and testing and data exchange across the asset owners and suppliers will enable that. So that's the quick big idea, and I think now it's time for questions.
A very big idea in 7 minutes or less. That was great, Matt. Thank you very much for that. We've got a couple of questions that folks sent me, and if you have other questions and you're waiting to ask them, drop them down below and we'll get to them in the priority that they come in. So first question that I have, there's an entire AppSec industry focused on security testing. Why can't existing tools and approaches handle embedded devices?
Yeah, so the short answer is devices are quite a bit different than apps. A device will actually oftentimes have thousands of different software applications inside of it. And a lot of the issues that we see, for example, hard-coded credentials, are something that are unique to embedded devices. So we see a lot of vulnerabilities that stem from the configuration of that device rather than just the software inside of it. The other issue we see with a lot of AppSec products is they may not support the tool chains and the programming languages that are being used all the time in embedded systems. So you just may not have coverage from the existing tools. And so it's important that you have some sort of tooling, some sort of testing that you can incorporate, even if it's manual.
Great. And we've got a question from Duncan. Where does SBOM and the other aspects of the executive order fit into your framework? And maybe just for those parts where it fits, refresh people's memory in case they don't have the EO in top of mind.
Yeah, so the executive order on supply chain included a provision around supply chain security, which effectively says that from a procurement standpoint, the federal government or other federal agencies can request things like a software bill of materials along with any device, any software that they're buying, probably devices as well. And they can also request testing results. So this is actually pretty consistent with what the executive order is asking for. So our view, and Alan's going to talk a lot about this here shortly, is software bill of materials is great. It's really important and it can arm your security team. If you do robust testing as part of the development process, the SBOM is a byproduct of that testing and can be produced and supported and sent to your customers very easily as part of that testing. If you're thinking about doing SBOM generation manually, you're probably going to have a rough road ahead. And so we recommend to use tools as much as possible.
Great. And then I think this is going to be the final question. Ty says, this is a great idea, but how do we get the world to pay for it? Which part of the world, is it going to be buyers, sellers? Will the government step in?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So our view is that what we're already seeing is a shift where buyers are starting to ask more questions about the security of products. And that is putting pressure on the device manufacturers, which is driving investments in security in a way that I think is really on a pretty significant upward trend right now, which is great for everyone. That's going to raise the bar. From there, I think that certain critical industries and governments might want to invest in additional verification post-deployment, post-purchase, and that'll be the cost of doing business. We want to make sure that we continue to make those security investments, especially in the critical networks.
Excellent. Matt, thank you very much for your time. And if you have other questions for Matt, you can continue to put them down in the chat window. And Matt, if you're game, you can just answer those as we go. Next up, very excited to present Miss Elisa Fiola. Elisa is the cybersecurity advisor working on supply chain cybersecurity for the U.S. Government Services Agency, GSA, including running their bug bounty program. Before that, she worked for the Air Force on Hack the Pentagon, as well as other projects. And in addition to all of that, she was instrumental in helping to pull together the RSA Conference's Supply Chain Sandbox. So thank you very much, Elisa. And I will turn it over to you for your 7 minutes of glory.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. So what I'm going to be talking to you folks about is, can you all see me on the screen?
You're in one of the little boxes, not in the big box.
It's okay. I like to say I have a big personality. So Matt, if you'll just make the appropriate facial expressions as I speak, I'd appreciate it.
Talk karaoke.
So awesome. Now my big personality is front and center. So I'm going to be chatting with y'all about the 7 steps of setting up a cyber supply chain risk management program. And so within supply chain risk management is all about logistics, right? Making sure you have what you want, where you want it at the right time. And that's awesome. And but there's other aspects where when you're talking about typical supply chain, you're really thinking about availability most of the time. And then in the cyber world, when you're talking about information, technology, and communication, it really is about integrity. You care about the provenance and making sure that what you have from what you've bought or what you've created really has what you want in it. So in order to do that, I have some 7 quick steps of making sure that that happens at the end in some ways that you might want tips and tricks to get there. So within an organization, if you're a startup or if you're a large enterprise company, you really do have a couple different layers. And that's at the enterprise, at the top, your C-suites, and then you typically deliver something, and that's the product. So that's at the system. But very rarely do you ever have the top talking to the bottom, and you want to make sure at the middle layer, the organizational layer, you also have some plans. So what that might look like is that you might be a business that you do both delivering software transformational products, or you manage buildings. So you want to have something at the top layer that the executives have a plan for managing supply chain, but then you also want to have something specific to your particular mission within that business. And then for the actual system, you want to know, how am I going to mitigate the supply chain threats and plan for it? So in order to do that, you need to know what you're doing and how critical it is. So that's where figuring out what is critical and what is disposal comes into play, because your system might be super important to you and to your customers, but it might not be extra critical and mission essential to the organization or the enterprise. And let's admit it, each business only has a finite number of resources that they can spend for protecting what they have. So they have to choose wisely and make sure that they're spending the appropriate amount of money for what is actually critical. And understand that not all things are equally critical, and some things might be disposable. But the catch here is making sure you know what connects to what, so that you're protecting the components all the way down, so that something that connects to a critical system is also thought of and also protected appropriately. And a major component for this is making sure you know what you're buying. And this is a key point that I cannot stress enough. Keep track of it after you've bought it. Like, because things change and shadow IT does exist. So you want to be able to respond and react very quickly when a supply chain threat is in play. And if you don't know what you've bought and you aren't able to keep track of it, then it's going to be extra hard. And that time after that threat happens is very vital. So you don't want to have to be scrambling at this time. Also consider the threats and the trade-offs. Play those scenario building games, do some chaos engineering, do some, I forget what it's called, the role play, and make sure that you know that like the likelihood and consequences if something could actually happen, and that you say, you know, it could happen, but I'm willing to accept that risk. Some things you are going to, some things you shouldn't. So just have that in mind as you're doing this. And most importantly, have a path to communicate throughout the organization. The people during a cybersecurity incident, especially supply chain, that want to know are going to be the CEOs, the business owners. They have the question, does this affect us? Those folks that are actually triaging and going through the effort to know that need to have a clearer path of communication to go from their logs up to the CEO in a way that is digestible for them. So the first time that you're going through that should not be when an incident actually is occurring. Also, there's countermeasures. You have to be aware of them. Does this affect you? Sometimes yes. Does it actually impact us? A lot of times, no. And that reason is because of the countermeasures that you've put in place prior to the attack happening. And finally, share your information. It's worth it, and it gets y'all to a better resolution quicker. So I'm ready for the questions now, Bo.
All right. Thank you very much, Elisa. That was excellent. All right. So diving into the questions, a couple of folks sent them directly to me. So Elisa, tell me, how can security organizations ensure that the procurement office understands the requirements and can implement them on the suppliers?
Yeah, so we highly suggest that you have some standard procurement language that you put into all of your contracts. And it's kind of the easy button way to have these templatized language so that this people actually doing the buying don't have to start anything from brand new or from scratch.
And are there available resources, template procurement buying guidance?
There is on our website, obviously, supplychainsandbox.org, and go to the resource section.
I'm just dropping that in the notes here.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, drop other questions for Elisa down in the chat if you have them. So Elisa, tell me, what are some characteristics of successful supply chain risk management programs that you've seen?
It's typically ones that have a standard enterprise buying program in place, and then before people buy components, that they do some sort of review, and supply chain risk management ends up just being one of the review factors. So it should be normalized and a part of the process and incorporated into the larger buying apparatus.
Okay.
So some things is sharing the knowledge, having a CMDB, and typically one that also connects into your overall governance, risk, and compliance program as well.
Okay, and those reviews, that's like reviewing checklists, or is it actually acquiring products, doing some security testing, or, you know?
I'm so happy you asked. It really varies depending on the criticality of what you're actually buying. So for something that is not, going into a nuke system, yeah, you might just want to do a vendor review, and the more you can do it risk-based and instead of compliance and checkbox based, the better. But if something is going into a very critical mission, you might want to test it out objectively first before you put it into your actual production system.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elisa. We appreciate your time here. And if you, again, if you have any questions for Elisa, you can drop them down in the chat and she can answer them as we go. Next, that brings up Dr. Alan Friedman. Dr. Friedman is the Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the US Department of Commerce. That is the NTIA. There he leads the software bill of materials process, convening private sector expertise to collect effective practices. And in addition to that, he will be hosting a SIPN bill of materials in just about an hour and a half, I believe. So if you go to supplychainsandbox.org/SBOM, you will see the ingredients list and you can put your last minute Drizzly order in. Alan, take it away.
Thanks so much, Bo. And thank you to Bo and Elisa and Duncan and so many others for doing all the work to get this supply chain sandbox off the ground. So SBOM is hopefully an idea that doesn't sound completely unfamiliar to folks today. And in fact, this morning, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Ann Newberg talked about some important things that we need to promote in the software ecosystem. And she highlighted that not all of them are advanced. Some of them are, she said, basic and maybe even obvious. And I think that's really how we should think about transparency in the supply chain, this is the basics. This is the table stakes for understanding what's in our supply chain. It's just saying, what do we have? It won't solve everything. And I want to be sort of very clear about that. This isn't going to magically solve all of our problems, but it is going to serve as the foundation for enabling a wide range of risk-based decisions. So how it's going to help is going to depend a little bit on what hat you wear. Some of us make software. Some of us are like Elisa and involved in choosing software. And many of us operate software. And in fact, a lot of us wear all of those hats. We're all in the supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. And SBOM really can support different approaches. If you make software, it's just going to say, hey, is the stuff I'm shipping good or bad, even before it leaves my network, before I build it. If you were in the process of choosing software, well, that builds on all the great points that Elisa just made, which is, hey, is this something that's there? And in fact, I would argue, even knowing whether or not someone can produce an SBOM, right? While it's still fairly novel, if you could choose between one product with an SBOM, one product without an SBOM, what does it say about the organization that's building the software if they can't produce an SBOM? I mean, hopefully by the end of this, I'll convince you that it's not that complicated. And of course, on the operation side, the hard work should be in finding new vulnerabilities. That's what great security researchers and hackers do. Once someone has done all of us the favor of saying, hey, this thing is bad, there's a vulnerability here, or someone tried to attack us, the easy part should be figuring out whether or not it affects our products. And that's really one of the goals here. So what is an SBOM? Well, there's a little picture here on the slide. We've got our toy model of Acme application, which has exactly two dependencies, Bingo Buffer and Bob's Browser. Bob's Browser, in turn, depends on Carol's compression engine. For each of these components, we don't need that much data. The minimum SBOM approach just basically says, hey, what's the component? What's the supplier? What's the version? Having a hash so that we can be sure that it's not some backdoored copy. And then where'd the data come from? Did this come from the supplier? Did it come from an expert like Matt? Or did it come from the further upstream originator? And that's the basics. The other thing I want to flag here is that we want to document known unknowns. Especially as we start this, we may not be able to have the full graph. So in this case, for example, Bingo Buffer, we may say, hey, we don't know if there are any dependencies there. It could be the very end of our tree, or it could be the top of a very dark branch. And again, as long as we can convey that known unknown, then we have the ability for someone like Elisa to come along and say, this is enough information, or hey, I need more. So the good news is that we have ways of doing this today. There are 3 data formats out there that can convey this data. SPDX, which is at Linux Foundation, CycloneDX, which is affiliated with the OWASP community, and SWID tags, which are something that my commerce colleagues at NIST have been playing with. And our focus has been to make sure that we can have interoperability between them. So folks can do this today, and they are doing this today. We have their organizations in different corners of the world that are producing this. Sunil Yu, who just gave a great talk with Josh Corman, one of the first things he did when he went to his new company, say, hey, do we have an SBOM? And then just went and published it. Because you know what? It shouldn't be that hard if you have a good process already. And we also have a lot of work trying to show that this is important and possible in less than mature organizations. So started off in the healthcare world, not exactly famous for being at the true vanguard of security and advanced technology. And for the last 2 years, they've been working on bringing together the people that make medical devices and the people that use medical devices in hospitals to show that SBOMs can be created and consumed. We're working with folks in the automotive sector through the AutoISAC, and we're just starting some work in the energy sector, in the bulk power community, partnering with the Department of Energy and Idaho National Labs for that front. So there's a lot of great ongoing work to show that this stuff can be implemented. I also want to say that there are some challenges, right? This stuff can be done today, but to make it scale, we're still working on some of these smaller details, such as how do we have good, robust global scaling solutions for software identity? We don't have a namespace for that. How do we think about sharing this data? This is another area where there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. If it's traditional, shipped software of a binary on a platter, well, that's great. Just put the metadata next to it. If it's a cloud service or an embedded system like what Matt was talking about, we need to find some other approaches. There are solutions out there today. So the core takeaway is that SBOM is coming. It was part of the executive order that a lot of folks have been talking about today. And there's a great line from that executive order that I want to quote, which is, in the end, the trust we place in our digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is. So the goal here is to say SBOM is going to be the foundation of transparency. And the goal is to integrate it into the future of supply chain management so that we can build on it and bring together more tools and bring together the resiliency so that as we learn about threats, and there are always going to be threats, transparency will allow us to react and make good decisions in response. So That's some of the basics of SBOM in 7 minutes. If you want to know more, there are tons of resources at ntia.gov/SBOM. It's an open process. We've got folks from around the world participating. It's not too late to get involved and help shape the future. So please join us, and I'll paste some information and my contact information in the chat as well.
Alan, thank you very much for that. And just so you know, I have my shaker here. You can't see it because of the screen overlay, but I've got my shaker here ready for 3 p.m. Pacific time for the SIP and bill of materials. So we have some questions for you, as you probably anticipated. First question. This is one I've heard a few times. Since SBOM is such a novel concept, shouldn't we wait for all the details to be worked out before organizations begin asking for a software bill of materials?
It's a great question. And I think there are a couple of different ways of approaching technical change. One of them is to go off and spend 6 years in hotel conference rooms trying to build the perfect solution and then hoping that it works. And often that's how we get great standards, but it's also how we waste a lot of time. The approach that the community has taken to say, hey, we are already doing this in certain parts, right? This is something that is part of a standard top quality DevOps approach. There are tools that will do this in the SCA marketplace today. And this is something that we can integrate. So let's build on what we have and sort of follow a crawl, walk, run mantra. So that's why the minimum approach, the core baseline SBOM, doesn't require too much data, and we can start building it. And we've also designed it so that partial gets us there, because knowing something about what's in your supply chain is a lot better than knowing nothing.
Great, thank you. We got a lot of questions, so we might not get to all of them. But let me ask this one. Can you talk about issues related to developing a hardware bill of materials? And is that different from a software bill of materials?
I'd argue that it is, and this is an area where folks like Matt are much more qualified to talk. But I'll give you one example about why they're different, which is if I want to show that I'm using a certain cryptographic library, I can take the hash, and then we can follow that down the stream. How do you take a hash of a DIM? So we talk about having namespace challenges in the software world. There's a lot that we need to work out in different parts of the hardware world. In some places, so for example, chips with baked in identity, that's easier. In other cases, especially if you're trying to show that something hasn't been tampered with, it gets a little trickier. I think the approach should be, rather than trying to build a single model for all supply chain data management, it's better to design things in a modular fashion, because that way we can start to add and layer as we go. And that's what we've tried to do for SBOM, is to say, hey, this data, we shouldn't wait until we can have everything together. We should sort of focus on saying, what data do we have now? And then how do we add to it and layer in an incrementing, non-disruptive fashion? So forward compatibility.
Great. All right. So how do you recommend organizations handle a library dependency with a vulnerability where the dependency doesn't have an update and where the vulnerability isn't exploitable based on the specific use of the library?
This is a great question, because it's one of the things that mature, good faith security people often look at SBOM and say, hey, wait a minute. I'm shipping software that has a known vulnerability, but I've got a lot to do on my team. And so, yes, we eventually want to fix something, or maybe there isn't an update available. So we're going to swap this library out. But for the moment, we're confident that our customers and their users aren't affected. And so part of this process is going to say, hey, in addition to SBOM, we want to be able to convey what we can think of as a negative security advisory. The ability, and we're calling this VEX, or the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange, the ability for a supplier to communicate downstream, we're not affected by this. So for example, the recent DNS bugs that Forescout found in a bunch of connected devices, the Linux Foundation process Zephyr wanted to communicate to anyone who was using their IoT-oriented operating system to say, hey, we're not affected by this. That's a useful piece of information that we're going to want to integrate into the community. And for those who are interested, we're implementing that through something called CSAF, C-S-A-F, which is an OASIS standard.
Great. Is having a full software bill of materials going to create issues? So if there's some vulnerability at the 7th level of a transitive dependency, is that going to create a roadmap for adversaries? And I realize that there's a lot packed into that question.
Sure. So one is depth, and then two is the roadmap to the attacker. Let's talk about the roadmap to the attacker question first, because those of you who are in security for a while have come across the idea that security through obscurity, not the best strategy. And so, but I say, you know what? It's 2021, we threat model. So threat modeling in 20 seconds. On one hand, the advanced adversaries probably don't need this, right? They want to know what's in your product, they'll figure it out. Anyone with a master's degree can build an SCA tool. At the other end, you have automated attacks, people that are just building scanning tools. And there, the solution is that we need to give the roadmap to the defender because they don't know what they have on their own network today. They're lucky they have asset management, but this is getting below there. So the question of depth, that's something that we do need some better science on, where the attackers are looking. I think a lot of it as it higher up in the stack, but then we hear great examples of just lack of resiliency. And my favorite story here is LeftPad, where it wasn't there was a vulnerability, but that everyone was dependent on a library without realizing that one person could have broken this entire approach. And so having visibility in the supply chain is going to not just help us defend against active attacks, but give us a better sense of resiliency. How much of my software is dependent on one person remembering to look both ways, or one person deciding not to take up the ukulele and sticking with their open source project?
Great. This is a slightly different one. What's been the most interesting part of hosting the SBOM process for the last several years?
It has been a true honor to be able to work with such an amazing community. Personally, I love it because I've gotten so many different perspectives on how rich and complex the software supply chain is. So on this very issue, we have folks who come from the cloud native world who say SBOM won't help because we already have this information. And then we've got folks in the serious embedded world who say, oh my God, my network, the software doesn't exist anymore in source. We only have binaries. How do we get this? And those are the challenges that we need to bring together and make sure that we can solve it and address it without having a one-size-fits-all approach, but still having enough of a common solution so that suppliers and customers don't have to do a million different things.
Great. And then probably the last one of the day, very serious question. For those who don't know, what does your shirt say?
This is the joy of running a small project without a budget. You got to do everything you can to promote it. So a couple of years ago at DEF CON, I decided we needed an SBOMs, not F-bombs shirt. We have an SBOM logo, and folks who want to know and want to participate, when we get back into the world, in the conference world, we'll make some t-shirts, we'll get some stickers for your laptops and your water bottles, and we'll build a movement. So please come and join us.